Hello and welcome. While we wait to get started and our Zoom space begins to fill up, I want to acknowledge our collaborators at the Wildenstein Plattner Institute who are currently joining Zoom, Elizabeth Groyeb, Sandrine Kanknak, and Samantha Rowe. It has been a pleasure working with you. I also see that my colleague Louisa Wood-Ruby is on here. And I would like to acknowledge David Morneau, who's kept this running so smoothly throughout. Looks like we're about at 168 participants, so just a few more seconds. It's really great to see so many familiar names. Looks like we're leveling out, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Samantha Deutsch. I am the Assistant Director at the Center for the History of Collecting. Welcome to the fourth installment of Recovering Women's Legacies, Catherine Lorillard Wolfe and A'Lelia Walker. I've seen this five-part series as an intellectual movable feast, as it were, beginning with appetizers in part one, showing you archive collections at the Wildenstein Plattner Institute and the Frick Art Reference Library. Part two was a variable research methodological salad, as it were. And parts 3 and 4, research case studies on Florence Sloan, Nanette Bearden, and today's double helping of Wolfe and Walker, tastemakers, collectors, patrons, as our main course. Next week, we will finish the feast with what we hope will be a delightful dessert or nightcap, depending on your time zone, with a conversation between historian Julie Desjardins and art historian Veronique Shannon Burke. It is my pleasure to introduce to you today's speakers, Margaret Laster and A'Lelia Bundles. Margaret Laster is co-edited the volume, New York Art and Cultural Capital of the Gilded Age, and recently contributed a chapter from Private to Public, Catherine Lorillard Wolfe, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Bequest of 1887 in the recent publication, What's Mine is Yours, Private Collectors and Public Patronage in the United States, Essays in Honor of Inga Reist. She also has the distinct honor of being the Center's first research fellow. A'Lelia Bundles is an award-winning journalist, public speaker, and founder of the Madam Walker Family Archives. She also serves on the board of the National Archives Foundation. She is the author of The Joy Goddess of Harlem, A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance, and On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker. As Margaret starts sharing her screen, I wanted to remind you to please use Zoom's Q&A application to ask questions you may have while the presentations are going on. You can ask them anytime. And if you would please, as you frame your questions, let me know who the question's for, or if they're for both of our speakers, that will be great and help facilitate the Q&A. You will see that I have added a link where you can watch the recorded sessions in about a month's time on the Frick's website, and also where you can register for next week's finishing dessert. Thank you so much. Margaret, I turn this over to you.
Thank you, Samantha and Louisa and our colleagues at the Wildenstein Plattner Institute for the invitation to participate in this series, or this meal, and introduce the figure of Catherine Lorillard Wolfe into this nexus of pioneering women. As Samantha mentioned, my work on this subject quite literally began when I was a pre-doctoral fellow at the Frick Center for the History of Collecting, and I continue to research and write about Wolfe to this day. In her 1988 Writing a Woman's Life, literary scholar Carolyn G. Helbrun reflects upon inherent gaps in the accounts women who are public figures produce about their own lives. Quote, "Women of accomplishment have had to confront power and control. Because this has been declared unwomanly, women have been deprived of the narratives or the texts, plots, or examples by which they assume power over, take control of, their own lives. This perspective on issues of power and control in narratives by and about women is germane to our series, Recording Women's Legacies. and especially apt when we consider the legacy of Catherine Lorillard Wolfe, a prominent art collector and patron of the early Gilded Age. This highly choreographed depiction of Wolfe on Alexander Cabanel's 1876 canvas, the end product of multiple sittings in the artist's atelier, reveals a strong and confident visage. Deemed the wealthiest unmarried woman in America at the time of her death in 1887, Wolfe played a pivotal role as the first female subscriber and benefactor of the newly formed Metropolitan Museum of Art, the lone woman among 105 male sponsors. One may conjecture that had it not been for her gender, Wolfe might have been eligible for consideration as a trustee. The Met did not amend its constitution to elect female trustees until the following century. Nonetheless, Wolfe's continued support of that institution from its incorporation in 1870 was fueled by a profound sense of civic obligation emanating from her position as a representative of not one but two prominent families of sizable means, each with roots stemming back to before the American Revolution. Wealth inherited from the vast Lorillard tobacco fortune on her mother's side, and the Wolfe family commercial holdings on her father's. Though now not one of the figures customarily recognized in the pantheon of 19th century art collectors, Wolfe established herself as an artistic arbiter and tastemaker in the Empire City during the 1870s and 80s, when the metropolis was fast becoming the dominant financial and cultural center of the United States. At this time, a new powerful bourgeoisie emerged, composed of entrepreneurs and industrial millionaires who differed from the mercantile elite who had preceded them, the latter of which Wolfe was herself a member. Over a period spanning nearly 20 years, Wolfe refined a deliberate strategy of amassing art to live with as an intact collection, which she would ultimately share with the museum-going public for the enjoyment and recreation of all who may frequent its rooms, and also with a view to the cultivation of the public taste for the fine arts. This was to be housed in a fireproof gallery bearing her name at the Metropolitan Museum, according to a crucial clause in her will. Wolfe's bequest granting the fledgling Met an entire private collection of more than 140 paintings and works on paper would be the first of its kind to an institution not yet 2 decades in existence. While others had mandated specific accommodations for their donations, none had approached the scale of this bequest, nor provided the addition of major funds, $200,000, which is nearly $6 million in today's value, for upkeep in future acquisitions. My research reveals that the donor's identity was as noteworthy as the scope of the bequest. To be sure, there were other prominent female collectors in New York and elsewhere in the country, and it is thrilling that we are discovering more women who were active in this period as the field expands. And this was the focus of a recent College Art Association panel that Samantha and I co-chaired. However, Wolfe's landmark benefaction was exceptional in an era in which gifts from women to public institutions were more often than not confined to decorative art and did not tend to include substantial sums of money. The issue of gender and the extent to which the collecting and patronage of art in late 19th century America was or was not congenial to women must permeate any discussion of Wolfe, particularly in light of her unmarried status. Lorillard family wills notably contain clauses protecting female members' inheritance from their husbands' interference. And this was a practice Wolfe later applied to her own female beneficiaries. In fact, the phrase proposals of marriage not accepted was rumored to be written on Woolf's calling card and remains part of the folklore surrounding her story. Save for her will and a scarce number of private correspondence, few documents in Woolf's hands survives. And I think this contrasts with the case studies we saw last week, as Evie's talk, had more copious collector's archives. Therefore, we must decipher Woolf's narrative from the particular choices she made and the strategies she employed as she used the materials of cultural currency to achieve recognition as art collector and patron. In New York, she amassed the work of highly sought after contemporaneous European artists, primarily of the French academic and Barbizon schools, and a sample of which we see here. These included works by William Adolphe Bouguereau, Camille Corot, and Rosa Bonheur. And in the lower left corner, we see Jean-Léon Gérôme's 1871 Prayer in the Mosque, a work which speaks to Woolf's interest in the popular genre of Orientalist themes of art and archaeology of the Near East. We do not know if she ever journeyed to this region because of potential travel difficulties a lone woman might face. But she did later underwrite archaeological expeditions to Assyria and Babylonia, and then donated some of the artifacts that were unearthed on these exhibitions to the museum. While the taste for the work of these living artists was shared by collectors of her generation, I have come to believe that Woolf's motives in acquiring them differed from many of the post-bellum new entrepreneurial and managerial elites who reconfigured patronage of the arts as an expression of class identity. Because of her secure social status, Woolf did not need to use collecting to transcend class boundaries, declare monetary success, or gain the confidence of others, as did many of her male peers. And with the absence of a designated picture gallery in her home, the culmination of Woolf's collecting would not be revealed to the public in its totality until the creation of the posthumous gallery in her name at the Met, although she would lend works to major civic exhibitions and to museums during her lifetime. Two formative spaces defined her self-fashioning in New York. The first, the relatively private space of her family brownstone where she compiled her collection. Woolf's life there was the deliberate construct of a strong single woman, fulfilling official and philanthropic obligations. The second, the Metropolitan Museum, to which she would leave her New York pictures, and which was the site that cemented her status as cultural benefactor. She was not merely a passive donor. Institutional records disclose that she did not shy away from withdrawing promised financial support to issue a statement or effect change. In the museum's second decade, Woolf canceled a large subscription to what was to be the permanent fund of the Metropolitan Museum because she felt its officers had not fulfilled their fundraising duties. Thus, she revealed an innate business sense and strong firmness of purpose in dealing with the institution that would receive her eventual gift. The family home where Woolf remained custodian of her art was an 1850s freestanding double width brownstone on the northeast corner of 24th Street and Madison Avenue, overlooking Madison Square Park. Since the residence no longer stands, it has been necessary to resurrect it from the ground up, weaving together data compiled from photographs, period maps, and other ephemera. And you see Wolfe's house on 24th in Madison, CLW. And I just also want to point out on the upper register, just north of East 26th Street, MJM, that's Mary Jane Morgan, whose collection Samantha told us about in our session 2 weeks ago. So we love that the two of them live so near one another. Wolfe resisted the lure of relocation in the city, even as prominent residents began to move north to construct grander palaces further uptown, and while her own neighborhood was becoming increasingly commercial. And she is said to have donated to the city in the 1860s a public drinking fountain installed on the southeast corner of the park, designed by sculptor Emma Stebbins, who would be best known for creating the Angel of the Waters at the Bethesda Fountain in Central Park the following decade. And the Bethesda Fountain still stands as a major landmark, but the drinking fountain, Wolfe sponsored, is now the site of a Shake Shack. Wolfe's only known completed building project and collaboration with architects took place in the early 1880s, when she extended her aesthetic reach across the Gilded Age terrain with the construction of her oceanfront summer cottage in the resort town of Newport, Rhode Island. Newport was undergoing a transition from having been a cultural haven for the literati prior to the Civil War to becoming the seasonal destination and social proving ground for the elite. Wolfe used her vast resources to establish a unique persona for herself in Newport by fulfilling a particular creative vision. She purchased a costly plot of land adjacent to that of her cousin Pierre Lorillard at Okra Point at the edge of the Atlantic. This alternate expression of her identity, seemingly removed from the constraints of the city, comprises an important aspect of my upcoming book manuscript. Here I argue that Wolfe exhibited a rare degree of independence and adaptability, and by extension, a second public projection of her persona as she journeyed from city to seaside. Unlike the existing framework that her inherited city home presented, this would be a custom creation from a blank slate. She named the resulting monumental stone residence and its accompanying grounds Vinland, to commemorate the putative Viking exploration of the New England coastline half a millennium before Columbus set sail for the New World. Such ideas had gained momentum when in the 1830s, a Danish antiquarian declared a circular stone tower in Newport, still standing, that the tower was a relic of Viking construction. In Newport, Wolfe substituted a predilection for art collecting that she had practiced in New York, where each individual work preserved its own element of autonomy, instead opting for a unified and site-specific environment, even if rooted in a fictive history. She hired Boston architects Peabody and Stearns and the British designer William Morris with other artists and artisans to create motifs with Nordic themes, designing and conceiving exterior and interior spaces as integrated assemblages, enhancing the historicist themes of the house. And here we have one such project, which was designed by William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones, a larger-than-life window of Viking gods and heroes. And we have the original window has been dismantled, and we have a sketch and one original extant panel of a Viking ship. When Vinland opened to guests in 1883, The Evening Post declared, "The name of Vinland typifies the story that is told by the house itself and by the decorative work that makes it a treasure house of art. Another example of what good art can do in the service of a good master." The following year, on the opening day of the National Academy of Design's spring exhibition in New York, Wolfe made the high-profile acquisition of Winslow Homer's The Lifeline, a now iconic painting of an attempted rescue at sea. Wolfe might not have seemed to fit the profile of a buyer of such a picture. As art historian Sarah Burns has asserted, parallels existed between the drama of natural law enacted in Homer's marine paintings and the drama of the rise and fall of fortunes in the tumultuous arena of American commerce. In her view, Homer's stormy sea paintings customarily appeal to financial speculators and businessmen, and Wolfe was neither wrecker nor rescuer. A local paper openly hoped that Wolfe's purchase demonstrated that the tide is turning and our rich collectors are beginning to patronize American as well as foreign art, and further argued that Homer's canvas would be well suited to hang with Wolfe's foreign paintings in her New York collection. This was not to be. Wolfe took The Lifeline with its seafaring theme to Vinland, where it illustrated a scene that one could imagine her even witnessing from her home, and it would not be part of the bequest to the Met. Yet Wolfe's purchase of Homer's painting, with its sexual underpinnings conveyed by the interaction between male rescuer and supine female, has been noted as indicative of the collector's penchant for romantic and chastely erotic narratives. This taste is evidenced in Wolfe's choice 4 years earlier of a very different yet thematically not dissimilar scene of two lovers fleeing an impending storm, deluge, in Pierre-Auguste Cotte's The Storm. Isn't it hard to imagine these two works juxtaposed on a single screen, let alone both belonging to the same person? The latter picture she bought specifically for the walls of her New York brownstone, and it remains enormously popular, even if critically disparaged in our own time. In his epic Art Treasures of America, Earl Shinn reveals that he was awed by Wolfe's assemblage of art in her Madison Square home, harvested from all the world's fairs of Europe. And I quote, "Evidence of the most advanced collectorship are everywhere visible." And he adds, "Take away from the public gallery or museum air, which might otherwise be conferred by walls so completely covered by canvases." Yet another observer remarked, "A collection of masterpieces hang here, there, everywhere. It is not easy to view these pictures," reinforcing that there were no boundaries between Wolfe's art and the furniture of her everyday life. In the mid-1880s, she decided to reinstall 3 of her pictures: her Cabanel portrait, a portrait of her late father, and Roman Girl at a Fountain, which she commissioned from the artist Leon Bonnat, and this was supposed to be one of her favorites. Wolfe had their frames removed, placed the portraits in niches, and the Bonnat in an oak frame attached to a cabinet. These changes in display would provide the catalyst for a legal dispute after Wolfe's death, focusing on differences between fine and decorative art. A challenge by some of her heirs over the classification of the Bonnat as decor argued that it should not be part of Wolfe's gift to the Met. The museum countered that the threatened removal of the painting would compromise the integrity of Wolfe's collection as a whole. John Wolfe, a collector in his own right and a second cousin of Wolfe's on her father's side, defended the museum's stance. He provided testimony to support the claim that his cousin, who drafted her will more than a year prior to these changes, never intended the Bonnat to remain a permanent fixture in her home. John Wolfe had at times functioned as an advisor to his cousin, and some of the pictures she purchased, he formerly owned, though, as I've discovered, not always in a direct line of succession. While she collected art to be lived with, kept together, and ultimately donated, her cousin was an avid buyer and seller of pictures. And a catalog accompanying a posthumous sale of his estate cited John Wolfe as having been largely instrumental in the selection of paintings Catherine Lorillard Wolfe bequeathed to the Met 7 years earlier, and other obituaries cited him with the idea of her bequest. Thus, at the time of his death, her legacy as patron and donor became partly his, even though he had not been the donor, and there is no evidence that he truly influenced her choices. One can speculate whether John Wolfe would have received this credit had Catherine Lorillard Wolfe been a man. Even before her death, there was speculation as to the fate of Wolfe's collections in New York and Newport. Her personal effects and house at Madison Square were left to other cousins from her father's family. The disposition of her artwork would follow another path. Months of negotiation between heirs and the museum regarding the condition of the gift and the readiness of a fireproof space, which Wolfe stipulated. Ultimately, Wolfe's pictures were at last presented to the public in a temporary gallery in November 1887, and later placed in what was a more permanent installation upon the completion of the museum's new south wing. By contrast, Vinland and its contents remained in the possession of cousins on Wolfe's mother's side, with a very large sum for upkeep. The estate was sold in the 1890s to the Twomleys, relatives of the Vanderbilts, and the Twomleys altered the exterior and interior footprints, removing much of Wolfe's interior display, although fragments and newly discovered pieces have made their way to museums and repositories on both sides of the Atlantic. Today, Vinland functions as part of the campus of Salve Regina University. In conclusion, Catherine Lorillard Wolfe's decision to leave her entire New York collection to the Met decades before the monumental 1929 bequest of Louisine Havemeyer, I would argue, became a template for later collectors. Had Wolfe's gift been merely in the form of a donation, she could have handed over her pictures without provisos and not insisted they be kept together. The fact of making the gallery an essential component of her bequest acknowledged on a very public scale her permanent contribution to the museum and foregrounded her reputation as patron. In later decades, her gallery would be dismantled, and much of her collection would spend more time apart than it ever had together, prompting consideration of the manifold implications of the fate of private collections when they fall under the stewardship of public institutions. Although the fund in her name remains an active endowment, leading to the acquisition of marquee works that have continued to elevate the museum's profile. And such paintings as the Cot are among those Wolfe's pictures customarily on view in the galleries. A text engraving of her name cements her standing alongside the museum's early benefactors. In our attempts to secure her legacy in the Gilded Age she inhabited, we can see that Catherine Lorillard Wolfe's contribution represents far more than a marker of her specific historical moment. She was a woman of consequence who effected real change on her own terms at a time when the diminution of female narratives was all too often the norm. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions, and I will pass the virtual podium now to Alelia.
Well, Margaret, that was fascinating. I learned so much. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to sharing the story of Alelia Walker and Madam Walker, my great-great-grandmother and great-grandmother, and their contribution to the arts in the early 20th century. So here we go. Hopefully, let's see, double click. There we are. So I hope everyone can see A'Lelia Walker on the left and Madam C.J. Walker, her mother, on the right. And while the title of this talk is about A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance, you really can't tell the story of her arts patronage without including her mother. They were amazing, lived an amazing life. Oh, it looks like I'm just hitting. There we go. Okay, I think we're good now. So Madam C.J. Walker, some of you may know, was an early 20th century entrepreneur, pioneer of the modern hair care industry, born in Delta, Louisiana, 1867, on the same plantation where her parents and older siblings had been enslaved. And yet, by the time she died in 1919, at age 51, she was a millionaire who had founded a company that employed more than 20,000 women. She was a patron of the arts, a political activist, and she died in her mansion in Irvington, New York, in Westchester County, in what was then the wealthiest community in America. Her daughter, A'Lelia, was born in 1885 and died in 1931. But as these women made their way from Madam Walker's life as a poor washerwoman in St. Louis to becoming a millionaire, they shared, even when they were poor, a love of the arts. Madam Walker was Sarah Breedlove in the church in St. Louis, where she had a good enough voice to be in the choir, even though she was a washerwoman. But they were surrounded by music, by ragtime, by German musicians who taught in the Black schools and Black musicians who had been trained at Oberlin. So music was very much a part of their lives. And I would say that while the arts, the painting and sculpture and other things interested them, and you will see some of that, it was really music that was the grounding for their initial foray into the arts. And I think part of that is that it was very difficult for African Americans to go to art school, to study art, to be accepted in art schools, but music was something you could do with your own body. And both women carried that love of music. This is A'Lelia Walker, who persuaded her mother, who after she had moved her company to Indianapolis, that they needed to have a presence in Harlem. And this is the house that she bought in the middle in 1913 on West 136th Street. She hired Vertner Tandy, the first licensed Black architect in New York, to redesign and remodel the house. And this is the double townhouse that ultimately resulted in the home where they had both a beauty salon on the first floor, the beauty school for the Walker Beauty School in the basement, and then the living quarters upstairs. All of their homes had pianos and Victrolas and harps. And even though neither of them was a musician herself, they had many friends who were, and they wanted to make sure that when they entertained, there would be instruments for the musicians to play. This is the beauty salon on the first floor, opened in 1913. Madam Walker had the headquarters for her business in Indianapolis. Here she is at the wheel of her Model T with her niece, and then the bookkeeper and the woman who was the manager of her factory. And in 1914, she hosted a party, a dance with 250 people, because her daughter Lelia was visiting from New York. And you see Madam Walker here on the left with the black lace a shawl, and right behind her is A'Lelia, even though it's a little bit blurry, but it gives you a sense of the elegance that they portrayed in their events. This is A'Lelia Walker from that same event, wearing pearl earrings given to her by her mother. And the program from the event, the dance card included in the performances was a classically trained opera singer, and Noble Sissle, who was from Indianapolis, a famous tenor, and you will know his name because he later teamed up with U.B. Blake. They were the famous duo. Madam Walker in her home in Indianapolis. And this is the parlor. And in the parlor, in the left, in the center, you see a painting. While it is very hard for me to make out that painting, and this is a very blurry version of it, I am pretty sure that it is a John Wesley Hardrick painting. John Wesley Hardrick was born in 1891 in Indianapolis, where Madam Walker was living, had studied with a famous white painter in Indiana, Otto Stark, who was part of the Hoosier School, who was a school teacher at Manual High School, which was when the schools in Indianapolis, before they became segregated in the 1920s. And Hardrick was one of his star pupils. He later studied in 1910 at the Herron School of Art in Indianapolis, and really went on to create quite a few very interesting works. Some of the major works were exhibited at the Indianapolis Museum of Art a couple of decades ago. But despite his talent, he really was not able to make a living as an artist, and worked in his family moving business and started a carpet cleaning business. But he is recognized as a very talented African-American artist. Madam Walker commissioned pieces from him in the early 20th century. Also, and this William Edward Scott, also from Indianapolis, also studied with the same teacher, Otto Stark, at Manual High School in Indianapolis, later went to the Chicago Art Institute, and then studied in Paris and was tutored by Henry O. Tanner, another famous African-American artist. Madam Walker commissioned pieces from him as well. And then after A'Lelia Walker persuaded her mother, 1913, they needed to have a presence in Harlem, she also began to encourage her to move to New York. So while the company remained headquartered in Indianapolis, Madam Walker began to build this mansion in Irvington, New York, also designed by Vertner Tandy, still standing, a National Historic Landmark, as well as a National Trust for Historic Preservation National Treasure. And this was an opportunity for her to entertain people and to show off, the wealth that she now had. You can see this is a convention in 1924 of some of her sales agents. And this is the music room in the house. Interestingly, by this point, she's had acquired some art by African-American artists. But in this particular music room, there are scenes, really sort of European pastoral scenes over the doorways, little murals. But this is where she entertained people. And at the opening event honoring Emmett Scott, who was the highest ranking African-American in the United States government during the war in the War Department, she always invited musicians to perform. J. Rosamond Johnson, who was a composer and the brother of James Weldon Johnson, really a Renaissance man, a diplomat, a secretary of the NAACP, and also a writer. Together, they wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing. But J. Rosamond Johnson was the impresario who put together the program for that opening party at Villa Lewaro. At Christmas, Madam Walker's only Christmas at Villa Lewaro in 1918, she invited a range of interesting people, veterans of World War I, artists, musicians. And she invited, this is the dining room. This is a modern picture, though the paintings on the ceiling are still the same. But she invited May Howard Jackson, who was one of the first African-American women sculptors, born in 1877, first Black woman to attend the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, graduated in 1895, exhibited at the Corcoran Gallery in 1915 in Washington, D.C., applied for membership at the Washington Society of Fine Arts. And though you can see she is a very light-skinned Black woman who could pass had she chosen to, the Washington Society of Fine Arts sent someone to her home to find out if she had Negro blood. And when she said yes, they declined membership for her. But she was one of Madam Walker's guests at Villa Lewaro. It showed how Madam Walker prized her friendships with artists. Madam Walker died in May of 1919 at Villa Lewaro. She's buried at Woodlawn Cemetery. And A'Lelia Walker became president of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company and began to try to live her own life. She was president of the company, but her real interest was in the arts. She is known as a patron of the arts during the Harlem Renaissance. Many great parties happened here at the house on 136th Street. She converted a floor of the house into a salon, a cultural salon. And this is A'Lelia Walker. You can see she is quite flamboyant. Langston Hughes called her the joy goddess of Harlem's 1920s because of her great parties, and both at the house on 136th Street as well as in her apartment on 80 Edgecombe and at Villa Lewaro. This is the invitation to the Dark Tower in 1927. for the aesthetes of the era. And she was friends with the artists, musicians, writers, and actors of that era. And this is a menu from the Dark Tower. On this menu is included A'Lelia Walker iced tea. And of course it was Prohibition. And I cannot say for sure what was in that iced tea, but I'm just guessing that there might've been something added. This is the room that she had designed by Paul Frankel, the Austrian interior decorator. And then the very back, it's very hard to see, but he was famous for building furniture that looked like skyscrapers. And so that dark tower, the bookcase in the back, is what gave the room its name. She is Augusta Savage, whom many of you may recognize as a very accomplished African-American sculptor. Born in 1892 in Florida, came to New York in 1921 to study at Cooper Union when she was 30. And she was awarded a fellowship to study in Paris in 1923 at the Fontainebleau. But once some of the administrators of the fellowship discovered that some of these Southern white artists, women, would be uncomfortable, as they said, with Augusta Savage. And so that offer was rescinded. She later studied in Paris with a Rosenwald Fellowship, but she credited A'Lelia Walker with hosting her first major exhibition in the house on 136th Street. She later started her own school in Harlem in 1932, ran a WPA art school, and then in 1939 designed the very famous sculpture that was at the World's Fair. She called it Lift Every Voice and Sing, inspired by the song written by the Johnson brothers, and the World's Fair committee renamed it the Harp, which I understand the name she did not like, but this particular piece was just magnificent, one of the most talked about pieces at the World's Fair. But Augusta Savage, always struggling as an artist, had done this in plaster, was not able to afford to recast it in bronze, and it was bulldozed at the end of the World's Fair. There are people who would like to see it reconstructed now, perhaps at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. But it is, as you can see, a magnificent piece, 17 feet high. A'Lelia Walker was friendly, as I said, with many of the cultural icons of the era. Richmond Bartay, a young artist who born in 1901 in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, studied in Louisiana and New Orleans, really working as a houseboy for a family in New Orleans. But they recognized his talent, helped him get to Chicago, where he attended the Art Institute of Chicago in 1924, and then he arrived in Harlem in 1929. Beautiful, beautiful pieces. And he did this portrait of A'Lelia Walker. Her friends commissioned it after she died in 1931. There also is a sculpture that Bartay did of A'Lelia Walker that is at the Schomburg Center in New York. She was a muse for many people. I've just picked a couple of things here. Bernice Abbott, the famous photographer, took photographs of A'Lelia Walker. And she also hired a number of African-American designers. Her clothes were custom made. This happens to be my grandmother's wedding in 1923. My grandmother's seated, and the clothes were all designed by African-American tailors and modistes. And this is a detail from the wedding dress. And Mildred Blount, who people know her name if they know it because she designed the hats in Gone with the Wind. She designed the headdresses for the wedding, and she credited A'Lelia Walker with her first commissioned hat. A'Lelia Walker was quite stylish. One of her coats that was on display at the Museum of the City of New York for Notable and Notorious several years ago. A list of her furs that she bought and stored at Wanamaker's. She knew Langston Hughes, again, who called her the joy goddess of Harlem's 1920s, Countee Cullen. Many of the young artists came to her parties, congregated at her parties. These are some of the books from her library, some of the books that were in at the Dark Tower. Signed a copy of the Weary Blues to A'Lelia from Langston Hughes. She knew Zora Neale Hurston, as well as Florence Mills. So I say that, while painting is what we're talking about with people's exhibits and sculpture, it really is music and the arts in general that A'Lelia Walker was interested in. Paul Robeson and his wife, Eslanda. Here's A'Lelia Walker at the Villa Lewaro in the music room, and you can see she is surrounded by pieces of art, works of art. She supported many musicians. Floyd Dabney, who was a famous musician during that era, played at an amazing event she hosted for the president of Liberia in 1921. She allowed filmmakers to come to Villa Lewaro. This is a poster from a film made by a Black filmmaker. She traveled to Egypt, and she was fascinated by the art that she saw on her trip to Paris, London, Monte Carlo, Nice, Cairo, Addis Ababa, and Palestine and Israel during that trip. This is Villa Lewaro, 1931, hosting weekend parties, her apartment at 80 Edgecombe Avenue. And A'Lelia Walker died in August of 1931. This is her funeral. She is buried at Woodlawn Cemetery. And the famous, at that point, pilot, Hubert Julian, a Black pilot, flew over the gravesite and dropped her favorite flowers onto the grave, just as he had done after Florence Mills's funeral, when he dropped blackbirds, because she was in the very well-known musical Blackbirds during the 1920s. And Langston Hughes wrote a poem for her called her the Queen of the Night. So I am always happy to tell stories about the Walker women, to talk about their patronage of the arts, and sort of broaden that lens and what it meant for them to support African-American artists and to be an example for other people. So thank you very much. And Margaret, I know we're ready for questions.
Thank you so much, A'Lelia. That was very eye-opening to me. I had read an account of the Black Tower by Romer Bearden, and he says that there weren't that many artists that frequented. So it's great that you are setting the record straight for us. Thank you so much. Margaret, I wanted to start off and ask a question to you. And that's, do we know why Catherine chose not to donate the Lifeline to the Met?
Yes, the Lifeline, she bought the Lifeline in New York at the National Academy of Design, but she brought it with her to Newport, which was the site-specific location that she had envisioned for it. So the Lifeline, along with all of the rest of her belongings at Newport and all of the art and all of the decor, was passed on to a cousin of hers, Louis Lorillard. So I think that she conceived of it even as part of her house when she acquired it. So it stayed with the Lorillard branch of her family and was passed on accordingly. There was, as I mentioned, a lot of people were very excited by that acquisition and hoped it would stay in her New York home. But the fact of her bequest to the Met was not public knowledge at that point. And actually, she was already finalizing her will and the list of paintings. So my interpretation is that she never even, it was just part of her home at Vinland for her. But luckily, it ended up at the Philadelphia Museum. So it's in another distinguished public collection.
Great, thank you so much. I have a question for A'Lelia. Did Miss Walker stay in and act within the Black community entirely, or was there crossover into the white community? This person, Lori Escalera, says that she knows from her grandparents there were certain communities which crossed over, but she didn't know how successful a Black woman would cross over even when gender could be a problem. Did female aristocracy cross ethnic boundaries to because they may have been more culturally inclined?
Absolutely. During the 1920s, she was very much a part of that sort of avant-garde scene in New York. And her parties were very integrated. So it was European royalty, downtown folks, artists, musicians. She was very good friends with Carl Van Vechten. So they often shared guest lists. He was often at her parties. But people like Paul Poiret, the famous designer from Paris. She went to his studio when she was in Paris. He came to one of her parties when he was in New York. And there are, other names that aren't as well known to people. Max Ewing was a librettist. And Max Ewing wrote these incredible letters home to his mother in Ohio describing A'Lelia Walker's parties. When she died, there was one person who wrote and had said she was the person who brought people together who no one else could bring together because she had the homes, the apartment on 80 Edgecombe. So people felt comfortable coming. There was always music. There was always a lot to drink. There was always good food. So she was really one of the people who was able to bridge that gap. If I can, I would just like to say something about Romie Bearden. I was able to interview him when I was beginning to do research in the early 1980s, and his mother, Bessie, and A'Lelia Walker were very close friends. Bessie Bearden, as you probably know, was a society columnist, among other things that she did, but a society columnist for the Black newspapers. And two of A'Lelia's best friends, Bessie Bearden and Jerry Major, were society columnists. They sort of had all the Black papers covered. But it meant that her parties and what she did was written about every week because these two women were writing about it. And Bearden, I went to his studio in Soho. As you may know, many of his family photographs and letters were destroyed in a fire, but he wrote me a letter describing his parents and A'Lelia Walker playing poker together and him being a little boy remembering that.
Fun story. I know he's really important to the study of African-American artists and also fostering those fostering artists like A'Lelia. There is one question that was asked twice, and that was if you could please give the name for the first female artist, sculptress that you mentioned. This is for A'Lelia.
Oh, May Howard Jackson,
okay.
Born in 1877.
Great. And I have a question from Veronique Shannon Burke. She'll be talking next week for Margaret. And she says, could Margaret please comment a bit more on Catherine's acquisition strategy? Did she have a relationship with dealers in New York or in France? Who was her intermediary agent or who helped her when she commissioned paintings? Did she buy at auction? You mentioned that she bought at the National Gallery of Design exhibition. Was that her main source of art collecting? And she says, thanks.
Thank you, Veronique, for such a great question. We don't have a lot of documents about Wolfe's art purchases during her lifetime, but research, some of it by me, some of it by other historians, has we can see various avenues she took. On the one hand, yes, there's National Academy of Design and auction, but also she was a frequent purchaser of Knoedler's. And I had the great privilege, sorry I didn't have time to mention this, to go out to the Getty, who holds the Knoedler's archives, and look up all of her receipts for all the works that she acquired. But also, I'm still reading through the correspondence from Knoedler's during the decades she operated, that I hope will help me decipher how she interfaced with the firm, because there's very little correspondence about her specifically, but I think from reading a larger group during that period, that will be very helpful. In addition, Samuel Avery also helped her with some of her acquisitions in New York, and of course her cousin John Wolfe, who I like to argue is given too much credit. She did purchase some works that formerly belonged to him because he was a collector/dealer and had various large-scale sales in New York, and she did acquire works from him either directly or through other collectors. I think in some instances she did have direct communication with artists, and particularly abroad. I just don't have all the paperwork for that. And with other collectors like John Taylor Johnston, she purchased from his sale. So it really is a kind of a melange of many different sources. I would like to answer one more question. Somebody asked me in Newport and William Morris. And in Newport, she sought out Morris and Co. She had various connections of how she would have heard about these artists and artisans. And she went to England and met with them in person, and also had a Boston-based designer who helped her commission various works for Newport. And the artist William Tross Richards, the American artist, had a studio in Newport, and she purchased from him directly. So it was a combination of a lot of different sources that we've been able to discover. She took advantage of, and certainly together she was able to compile such an impressive collection. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Likewise, I have a question for you, Liliet, from Veronique. I'm prioritizing this because I think she's putting together her material for next week. She wonders if Alilia only did commissions, or whether or not she purchased from art galleries or exhibitions or even auctions.
I don't really know the answer to that, but I think people came to her. She heard about them. I'm guessing that the relationship with Augusta Savage is she knew that Augusta Savage was doing sculpture. Some of it was exhibited at the Schomburg Library, which was right behind her house. And people would they would make sure that Alilia Walker was invited to their shows. So she would have seen it in that way.
And there was a question that's tangentially related, and that's that the person had noticed that some of the photographs she was showing were 1926, and she was wondering how Alilia fared during the stock market crash, the Great Depression.
Like everybody else, the company suffered. What the sales were, plummeted to 10% of what they had been when Madam Walker died. But the company never went out of business, actually still is in business. It's had 3 owners, but my family was involved into the 1980s. It was purchased by someone else. And then it's now actually a division of Unilever from a company. The Sundial Brands purchased the company in 2006, but now it's a division of Unilever.
Okay, great. And I have a question for you. There's several questions about Vinland, Margaret. One was whether or not it was still standing, and Vivian Barnett asks, did Wolf acquire other works of art for Vinland, and do you know where they were hanging?
Okay, yes, Vinland is still standing. It's part of Salve Regina University now, so it's been repurposed as a university building. Vivian, that question is the base of my project. I'm trying to discover what work she had at Vinland and where they hung. So there's, that is a big detective story. I have uncovered a fair number of projects that a lot of them were decorative projects, and kind of been able to plot out where some of them might have hung. She did have a wonderful frieze by Walter Crane, which hung in her dining room, and people would visit and talk called Skeleton and Armor, which was also telling the story of the founding of Newport, and people would speak of having dinners or teas there and seeing it. But there's no inventory for Vinland, and so a lot of it is detective work, trying to unpack and trying to figure out where everything was and what was there. And it was really arts and crafts interior, and but a lot of the work was by William Morris, Edward Burne-Jones, Walter Crane, and she had some American works there as well, including, of course, Lifeline by Winslow Homer. But there's it still is a detective job trying to really recreate the installation, and that's something I've been working on for about a decade. But thank you for asking.
Thank you. We're running out of time, but I want to ask a similar question to you, Alilia. Someone had asked if Alilia's townhouse was still standing in Harlem, and also if there had been any attempts to reconstruct the Dark Tower.
So that building, that wonderful, beautiful building was torn down in the 1940s. It would never happen today, I would hope. But at that point, the home for an African-American woman was not considered very valuable, unfortunately, but it would be great if it were there. Even though you said I had finished writing The Joy Goddess of Harlem, it's not quite finished.
Okay,
but
sorry.
when it comes, that's all right. My editor wants it to be finished, and I do too. But when it comes out next year, I'm hoping that some of the book parties we have will be an attempt to recreate the Dark Tower and the spirit of the Dark Tower. But many people are still inspired by it.
Great. Might you both have another time for another question? Or if you have to log out, I respect that.
Absolutely.
Okay,
and I hope that you can capture those questions. Maybe we can answer them.
I will absolutely send these questions to you guys with emails so that if they didn't get answered today, you can answer them directly.
Yeah, no, that would be that. Thank you, everyone, for all the questions. They're really wonderful. Thank you.
I have another. This is for A'Lelia. How excited, or they say shocked, were you growing up when you realized the extent of your grandmother's and great-grandmother's collecting and social life? Does research ever end?
No, the research never ends. But yeah, I mean, certainly I grew up and I did not, my parents were smart enough not to make it a big deal. But my excitement in life after I left my long career in network television news was really to delve into these women's lives. And I'm just going to reach and get something and show you. I'm always discovering something new. This is the A'Lelia Walker's log and diary from her trip to Europe, Africa, and the Middle East in 1921. And I just found it 3 years ago. So I'm still finding stuff.
That's great.
I am very envious of you that you have a diary. That's wonderful.
Like all of it, she didn't keep it every day, but there's enough that it gave me some great hints.
And just to end it with one last question, and this is for both of you. This is Lori Esclarage. She says she studied some amount of European female aristocratic art collectors and salon creators. Did the American female aristocratic salon art collectors reach across the pond to fraternize with the European women of social standing, like the Europeans did with each other?
Oh, what a great question.
Might be a long question.
I have to think about that for a bit. I know that that Catherine Lord Wolfe did travel quite a bit to Europe, not only to see Morris and the artists about Finland, but to visit the shows, to look at art. I don't have really records of her socializing with European collectors, but that's a wonderful question, and I think it's something that's worth pursuing. Thank you very much. Oh.
Okay, I think I'm going to end it there unless you have anything to add, A'Lelia.
No, just so glad to have been able to share stories with people about A'Lelia Walker. Stay tuned for the book next year.
And I am.
I'm just sharing my screen, Margaret, for next week, which I've put in the chat where people can register if they haven't yet.
Okay, yeah.
So I will definitely pass on the questions to you guys.
Is this a lot of questions that we had? Yeah.
We did have a lot of questions. This is very lively. So thank you both so much. This was really wonderful, and thank you all for coming. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.